Dear students, welcome to the class. Today we'll talk about Victorian era and its chief characteristics. Victorian era in British history, the period between approximately 1820 and 1914, corresponding roughly but not exactly to the period of Queen Victoria's reign, that is 1837 to 1901, and characterized by a class-based society, a growing number of people able to vote, a growing state and economy, and Britain's status as the most powerful empire in the world. During the Victorian period, Britain was a powerful nation with a rich culture. It had a stable government, a growing state, and an expanding franchise. It also controlled a large empire and it was wealthy, in part because of its degree of industrialization and its imperial holdings, and in spite of the fact that three-fourths or more of its population was working class. Late in the period, Britain began to decline as a global political and economic power relative to other major powers, particularly the United States, but this decline was not acutely noticeable until after World War II. The Victorian stereotype and double standard. Today, Victorian connotes a prudish refusal to admit the existence of sex, hypocritically combined with constant discussions of sex, thinly veiled as a series of warnings. There is some truth to both sides of this stereotype. Some few educated Victorians did write a lot about sex, including pornography, medical treatises, and psychological studies. Most others never talked about sex. Respectable middle class women, in particular, were proud of how little they knew about their own bodies and childbirth. In addition, Victorians lived with a sexual double standard that few ever questioned before the end of the period. According to the double standard, men wanted and needed sex, and women were free of sexual desires and submitted to sex only to please their husbands. These standards did not mesh with the reality of a society that featured prostitution, venereal disease, women with sexual desires, and men and women who fed same sex desires, but they were important nonetheless. Gender and class in Victorian society. Victorian society was organized hierarchically, while race, religion, region, and occupation were all meaningful aspects of identity and status. The main organizing principles of Victorian society were gender and class. As is suggested by the sexual double standard, gender was considered to be biologically based and to be determinative of almost every aspect of an individual's potential and character. Victorian gender ideology was premised on the doctrine of separate spheres. This stated that men and women were different and meant for different things. Men were physically strong while women were weak. For men, sex was central, and for women, reproduction was central. Men were independent while women were dependent. Men belonged to the public sphere while women belonged in the private sphere. Men were meant to participate in politics and in paid work, while women were meant to run households and raise families. Women were also thought to be naturally more religious and morally finer than men, who were distracted by sexual passions by which women supposedly were untroubled. While most working class families could not live out the doctrine of separate spheres because they could not survive on a single male wage, the ideology was influential across all classes. Class was both economic and cultural and encompassed income, occupation, education, family structure, sexual behavior, politics, and leisure activities. The working class, about 70 to 80% of the population, got its income from wages, with family incomes usually under $100 per annum. Many middle class observers thought that working class people imitated middle class people as much as they could, but they were mistaken. Working class cultures, which varied by locality and other factors, were strong, specific, and premised on their own values. The middle class, who got its income of $100 to 1,000 per month from salaries and profits, grew rapidly during the 19th century from 15 to over 25% of the population. During the 19th century, members of the middle class were the moral leaders of society. They also achieved some political power. The very small and very wealthy upper class got its income of $1,000 per annum, or often much more, from property, rent, and interest. The upper class had titles, wealth, land, or all three, owned most of the land in Britain, and controlled local, national, and imperial politics. Religion and science in the Victorian era. Most Victorian Britons were Christians. The Anglican churches of England, Wales, and Ireland were the state churches of which the monarch was the nominal head and dominated the religious landscape, even though the majority of Welsh and Irish people were members of other churches. The Church of Scotland was Presbyterian. There was some religious diversity as Britain also was home to other non-Anglican Protestants, notably Methodists, Roman Catholics, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and others. At the end of the period, there were even a few atheists. Alongside their faith, Victorians made and appreciated developments in science. The best known Victorian scientific development is that of the theory of evolution. It is typically credited to Charles Darwin, but versions of it were developed by earlier thinkers as well, and the pseudoscience of eugenics was an ugly outgrowth of Victorian evolutionary theory. Victorians were also fascinated by the emerging discipline of psychology and by the physics of energy. Government and politics in the Victorian era. The formal political system was a constitutional monarchy. It was in practice dominated by aristocratic men. The British Constitution was and is unwritten and consists of a combination of written laws and unwritten conventions. At the national level, government consisted of the monarch and the two houses of parliament, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The monarchs during this period were Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901, preceded by King George IV from 1820 to 1830, King William IV, who ruled from 1830 to 37, and followed by King Edward VII, who ruled from 1901 to 10, and King George V, whose tenure was from 1910 to 36. During the Victorian period, the House of Commons became the centre of government. The House of Lords lost power, though it remained influential until the Parliament Act of 1911 and the monarchy transformed into a symbol of the nation. The House of Commons consisted of about 600 men or members of parliament, that is MPs, who were elected to represent the counties and boroughs of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. England had many more representatives than the other three nations by virtue of its status as first among these four equals, the product of tradition as well as its greater political power and wealth. The upper house, the House of Lords, was populated principally by several hundred noblemen who had life tenures. Members of both houses were wealthy men. Formal national politics was dominated by two major parties, the Liberal Party and the Conservative or Tory Party. At the start of the period, MPs were elected by the half-million property-owning men in a population of 21 million who had the vote. In 1829, the vote was granted to Catholic men and in 1832 to most middle-class men. In 1867 and 1884, the franchise was extended to working-class men. Most women over age 30 got the right to vote in 1913. Full adult suffrage with no property requirement was achieved with the Second Representation of the People Act 1928. This story of the expansion of the national electorate is important, but there is more to political participation than voting at the national level. Local politics were also important, and being denied a voice and access to institutions certainly did not render non voters indifferent to politics or to how power was wielded. They made their opinions on these known via demonstrations, petitions, and pamphlets. Important political events during this period included the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, the expansions of the franchise, working class political activism, most notably Chartism, the rise of liberalism as the dominant political ideology, especially of the middle class, and the nationalization of conservative and liberal parties, and the emergence of British Labour Party in 1906. The growth of the state and state intervention was seen in major acts that limited hours for factory workers and miners, in public health acts, and in the provision of elementary education by the state. Political conflicts between Ireland and Britain and the rise of Irish nationalism were also hallmarks of the era, as were women's rights activism, which resulted in the Married Women's Property Acts, the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts, and the growth of education and employment options for women.